Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Our guest this morning is Mr. Joseph Page and Michael Wynne. They join us to talk about some of Alexandria's rich history. Gentlemen, good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
It's good to have you both back. It's been a while for both of you, but Mr. Joe, just start by telling people what you do.
Well, I'm currently working as the executive director of the Alexandria Housing Authority. I've been there for 5 years now.
And before that, you had a long stint with the city.
I worked with the city for 9 years, and prior to that, I worked for 30 years with Procter & Gamble and retired from there.
Wow. And so, Michael, tell people exactly what you do.
I hate to say I'm retired because I'm probably busier now than ever before. I worked and ran the state probation and parole office for adult criminals. I worked with Probation Pro for 38 years. Our office was over 6 central Louisiana parishes. Although I am retired from that job, I'm in my second chapter of my life. I'm writing articles, writing books, doing research, and just having a great time.
Wow. It's hard to think that you're busier now than what you were. So you must really be digging up a lot of history.
Absolutely. I have some fascinating stories, of which today is one of the best.
So how did you come to find Mr. Joe Page's grandfather in history?
Although he wasn't lost, he was sadly forgotten.
Wow.
The last 5 years, I've been studying our history in central Louisiana, all the stories, all the tales. And what I have found is that a lot of the information out there is by rumor. There would be various mentions of various stories, but nobody had done any actual research on it. And I am I'll just be very blunt. I'm very skilled at research, having done it for nearly 50 years. So I knew where to look. And not only am I finding that the true story, the complete story, is much more interesting than a rumor, I'm also finding many stories are not true at all.
Wow.
But I did uncover Charles Frederick Page. Now, he's been mentioned over the last century. The earliest mention in the Alexandria Town Talk is in 1881 on Page when he purchased his marriage license. But he's been mentioned many times, but other than his descendants like Joe, he's been largely forgotten. But he, quite frankly, may be not the greatest African American, but just the greatest American that Louisiana has ever produced. He is a fascinating man, and he's contributed so much, and we have lots to talk about him.
So tell me how he popped up. I mean, how did he grab your attention out of all the research and the people that you're looking at? How does he jump off the page to you?
I went through I have a very good library on and vertical files and materials on Rapides Parish, Central Louisiana history and its people. Not a single book, and there is 7 histories of the parish, and there's many histories of the individual communities like Pineville, but not a single of one of these books has any reference to Charles Page. But I came across an article when I was researching about Charles Page, his obituary in 1937 in the Town Talk, and it was fascinating to read. And using various search tools, including newspapers.com, that you have to be a member of, they can optically read newspapers. So by searching under the name of Charles Page, I was able to start coming up with articles about him, and about 24 articles. And I was just floored about the accomplishments of this man. So I decided to do a report on him, and it led me to other people, including Joe, who's filled in some gaps.
Wow. So, Mr. Joe, when you were growing up with your grandfather, did he tell you these stories of what we're about to talk about? Did he tell you and your siblings about his work and about his skill?
Well, unfortunately, I was not able to hear those stories because he died a year before I was born.
Mm-hmm.
But I always heard the stories from my parents and my aunts and uncles all my life about what my grandfather had accomplished and what he was planning to do with regard to airships. So I knew the story all my life. And I would tell these stories to my classmates, and they did not believe me. And for a long time, I was even reluctant to tell the story because nobody would believe the story.
And that's what I was going to ask you. So, your grandfather, Charles Frederick Page, in the 1800s, he built and, well, really in the 1900s, built and designed an airplane. And all of these things that you knew about him, did you start to believe that these were just wives' tales?
No, I never believed that they were wild stories. I believed that they were accurate and true because I had no reason to believe that my parents and my aunt and uncles would fabricate a story like that and
Right.
tell the whole family. Not only were we told about it, people who live around us, close to us in the Pineville area, knew the same story. So it was automatic for me to believe that what things were being told to me about my grandfather was in fact the truth.
And so when you started to hear these stories, obviously he was a man with great math and science skills. What did the family talk about his education and his gifts and his abilities? What were those stories like?
Well, in those stories, I don't think they ever said to me or my cousins or my siblings whether or not my grandfather had a formal education. I don't believe that he did. I knew my grandmother had because she was a school teacher,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that my grandfather had a formal education. He was a timberman and a farmer. That was what he was known for in the Pineville area.
Do we know how he got over into building airplanes and ships?
Well, one story that resonates in my mind is told to me by my aunt, my dad's sister, that my grandfather would sit on his porch in the evening and watch mosquito hawks flying. And he felt like that he could imitate the flight of the mosquito hawk, which I guess was his inspiration to design and build the first airship.
Wow. And so, was there ever any drawings, or had the family uncovered like anything that he had done back in the early 1900s?
Yes, in fact, we have a drawing of a side view and a top view of the airship he designed and built. In fact, that same picture is with the patent that he received in the United States and Canada. So we've always known about the story and we knew about the picture.
Wow.
We saw the picture of the airship.
Let's take a break here, but when we come back, I want to talk about uncovering the facts and how so many people in history did so many amazing things. And you almost hate to use this term, but you have to. They are hidden figures. Our guests this morning, Mr. Joe Page and Michael Wynne, and we're talking about history that was made right here in Central Louisiana. Stay on point. We're back after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. Our guest this morning is Mr. Joe Page and Michael Wynne, and we're talking about the history of Mr. Joe Page's grandfather, Charles Frederick Page, and the fact that he was really the inventor and the designer of an airplane even before the Wright Brothers, and how he had been hidden in history, not just African American history, but hidden in history. And so, Michael, when you start to uncover that all of this has happened, what do you do to get down to the story and the facts of the story?
People during their lives leave behind lots of bits of evidence to I am somewhat skilled in researching, so I'm able to find a lot of these bits and pieces of evidence from city directories to censuses to newspapers. And when you take all these little pieces of the puzzle and you start putting them together, you start forming an image. And this image, the more and more you learn about Charles Frederick Page, the more fascinating he gets.
Wow. And so you were referencing while we were not recording that the Town Talk in 1904 did a lengthy article on him. Tell us about that article.
We, of course, know how race relations were at the turn of the century. And for the Town Talk or any newspaper or any media back in 1904 to do a lengthy complimentary article on an African American was unheard of. I have not even seen that happen, a complimentary article in any newspaper at that time. And the Town Talk in this article in 1904 helps verify what was happening, because this was news at that time. And we know exactly what happened regarding the World's Fair, regarding the patent. They actually looked at Charles Frederick Page's airship. Now, back then in 1904, the term airplane was not used because it was still being invented or processed. They basically called them airships in 1904. And Page's patent also calls it an airship.
So I wonder, do we know how he had the bandwidth to get a patent in 1904?
You know, getting a patent today even is very difficult.
Right.
A lot of people even have to hire companies to help process a patent application. Considering that Mr. Page was born a slave, we believe in 1864, I'm still checking on that, and was self-taught in reading and writing. For him, with a man who's running a business, has 13 children, to be able to create this monumental machine, an airship, and file a patent all by himself is just, quite frankly, unbelievable. It's like you or I today creating a rocket ship to go to Mars.
Right. So, Mr. Joe,
he did it.
He did it. So, Mr. Joe, when Michael calls you and starts to tell you about your grandfather, what feelings do you have about that? Because you had been trying to tell people this and just kind of said, well, nobody really believes it.
Well, of course, I was quite excited, and obviously I did not know Michael Wynne, and it's been a pleasure meeting and getting to know him. So when he called me and told me about what he had discovered about my grandfather, my first reaction was, wow, his story is going to be told again. Maybe somebody will listen this time.
Wow. So what do you and your family, over the years, did y'all talk about the brilliance of your grandfather who had been a slave, who dared to succeed? I mean, who dared to embark upon creating something that they probably had no idea how monumental an airplane would be.
Well, the stories I heard about my grandfather growing up, he was a larger-than-life figure in my mind. In fact, I have a 8x10 picture of him on my nightstand, and folks tell me that I look like my grandfather. But he was a larger-than-life figure in my mind. And I would hear my parents and my aunt and uncle talk about Papa, they would call him. He'd do this, and he did this. And I thinking as a kid growing up, I said, wow, this must have been an amazing man.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you think about the engineering that went into building this airship, and then if you read the article that goes with that patent that describes in detail how it is supposed to work, it is amazing that he was able to do that, even think about building this, designing it, and then writing a description of how it is supposed to work.
Wow.
Without an engineering degree or any formal education, is an amazing feat.
So, Mike, when you find the patent and you read it, what are your thoughts about it?
First of all, I couldn't do what he did. And I'm a college educated person. And here's a man who we believe, he did not complete high school, as far as we know, self-taught.
Mhm.
I read through this and I'm absolutely amazed.
So
And
where do you find it at, Mike? Where do you find all of these documents? Do they come from Mr. Joe's family's archives, or where did you find them?
the pieces came from many different sources.
Okay.
A lot came from the town talk in using my search techniques, some from the courthouse, some from Joe's family, some from the city directory of that time. And then I started doing some internet research, and I was able to find some articles, including from the Air and Space magazine, which is put out by the Smithsonian, which answered a big question about Mr. Page. Maybe a brief overview of Mr. Page's early years might help in telling his story. Would you like me to share that?
Absolutely.
As far as I can tell, in putting everything together, about 1898, Charles Page started designing his airship behind his two-story house, which was located at the corner of Edgewood and Highway 28, what they used to call Holloway Prairie Road in the old days, behind what is now Walgreens.
Mm-hmm.
He built it in the barn.
Wow.
In 1904, he took out his life savings. In 1904 was the Louisiana Purchase World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri. And what I learned from the Air and Space magazine is why Charles Page was so interested in it. They had an aeronautic competition, the first of its kind in 1904 at the World's Fair, in which the grand prize was $100,000, which would be nearly $1 million.
Wow.
But more important, the winner of the aeronautic competition would receive international attention. So Charles took out his life savings. He had built the model, had tested it behind his house in Pineville, and had it shipped off by rail car to the World's Fair. He was going to follow it and presumably fly it. Unfortunately, someone stole his airplane and probably destroyed it.
So let
and
me
it might
stop
have
you
been
there.
used-
So let me stop you
Go
there.
ahead.
So, Mr. Joe, with that part of the story, like he had done all of this work, it was all documented, and the plane was stolen. What was the story in the family about the plane being stolen?
The story in the family was that he was devastated about what had happened, and the fact that he had put so much energy and all of his money into this project, and so he felt nothing but devastation. But the one thing that I heard in the family all the time, although he was highly disappointed in the airship being lost, he was always more interested in people than he was the airship.
Wow.
So he just spent the rest of his life trying to help people in the neighborhood and do things that would uplift people.
Wow. Let me take a break here, but when we come back, we'll talk about that trip that should have been made to that state fair that could have changed his life and the Page's family's life forever. Stay on point. We're back with more after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. It is always incredible to hear about stories that happened right here where we live in central Louisiana, stories that have never been told or have been told really among family and friends who were a part of that story or who that story was passed down. We're talking about Mr. Charles Frederick Page, who was Mr. Joe Page's grandfather. And we were talking about this airship and how he had taken everything that he had and invested in it. He sends it via railway to the state fair. So, Mike, does history tell us if it was racially motivated, what was the motivation if we know about why this had to be a huge piece of equipment was stolen?
We don't know why it was stolen, but I have two beliefs. One is racially motivated, where I guess white people may have been trying to destroy the legacy or the invention of an African American. That's a possibility. The second possibility is that this machine worked, and this was a very valuable commodity.
Right.
It could be more than a footnote in history. It could be chapters in history if it had won the aeronautic competition at the Louisiana Purchase World's Fair in St. Louis. We'll never know. It disappeared. Joe said it very well. He was devastated. Now, here's the interesting part. Charles Page sent this off in 1904, but Charles had actually filed the patent application in 1903. It took 3 years to process it. And so he got the patent in April of 1906, even though he had given up on the project. But the Wright brothers, who got all the fame, did not get their patent until a month later in May of 1906. He was not only the first African American ever to get a patent on an airplane, he was the first American to get a patent for an airplane. He should be a leader in national aviation history and the best known person from Central Louisiana.
Right. So, Mr. Joe, did y'all know any of that at the time, or was it after Michael started unearthing all of this that you all understood that he was literally ahead of the Wright brothers?
Yes, we always knew that as children growing up. We always knew the stories. The only thing new that I learned from Michael's research is that I knew about the model that he built and shipped to St. Louis World's Fair. I always thought it was a small model that you put on a table or something.
Right.
Well, what Michael discovered in his research, it was a working model at full scale that he had actually attempted to fly this airship. I did not know that part.
Wow. And so this was the World's Fair. So this was, you know, he not only had he probably spent countless hours building and thinking about how to make this work, but he had also invested his life's earnings probably in this.
Right.
And so what happens after it's stolen? I mean, how does the story end after that? I mean, what does history say about that, Michael?
In some ways, the story just began. That accomplishment by itself should make Charles Frederick Page nationally known. But what he did after, even though he let his patent expire after 1906, what he did after makes him a great man also. This man is one of the most diverse men in all of Louisiana, if not American history. I went through all the mentions of him. He was a cobbler. He did dental work for people who could not afford to do dental work. He built coffins for people who could not afford coffins.
Wow.
He set up a corporation for the leading African Americans in order to train them on how to run large businesses. Now remember, this is prior to World War I in the 1920s, when this was unheard of. He created the theory of diversified farming, something that he never got credit for. Diversified farming was basically, in very simple terms, a way for tenant farmers to be able to eventually own their own land. And he created this. He's the first documented person, yet he never received any credit. And it goes on from there. He helped build Greenwood Cemetery in Pineville, and he learned how to run a cemetery and was put in charge of it, and later created his own cemetery, the Lincoln Memorial Cemetery on Mason Street in Pineville, where he was eventually buried in 1937. He also created, according to one article, unique tools on how to manage the cemetery. Unfortunately, we don't know what they were. Another thing connected to his airplane, he designed a parachute. He designed a parachute when people had not even ridden in an airplane. He was already thinking ahead that at some point people will want to jump out of airplanes. He designed a parachute. We do not have those drawings, but we have contemporary contemporary articles that talk about this. Early in the or late in the 1800s, he was one of the best known lumbermen in all of central Louisiana. His company supplied the telegraph poles and the railroad
Wow.
ties for all over central Louisiana. He could look at a tree and determine how many board feet there were. But one of the greatest events in Charles Frederick Page's life is in 1911. A man by the name of William Wirt Ellis, a white man, died due to allegedly being killed by an African American. Charles Frederick Page, as an elder in the Methodist Church in Pineville, helped to quell the riots that would have probably occurred. He helped stop racial violence. And this is not 2020. This is 1911.
Wow.
He was that much of a leader among the people in central Louisiana.
Mr. Joe, let me stop you right there. Mr. Joe, did you guys have any idea of the brilliance and how ahead of his time he really was?
Yes, we heard all of those stories growing up and how diverse he was in his participation in the community and the things he did. He had a very large family. As Michael mentioned, he had 13 children. 2 died as infants, but 11 children lived to adulthood. So we heard all of these stories of the things that he was involved with in his community. And as I heard those stories and as I got older, I said, wow, this is the same thing we're trying to do now.
Right.
In 2020, he was trying to do in the early 1900s. So we were, again, because of those stories, he was almost like a larger-than-life figure to me in my mind.
And he was a larger-than-life figure. So, Michael, going forward, understanding all of the things that Mr. Page did in his life, how now does that become archived? How now does that become a part of history? Not just African-American history, but history.
Before I mention that, I want to mention 2 other accomplishments. He was also a coal miner, and he also cabinet maker, and he was also homeless in the 1923 Pineville tornado. But this is what I'm hoping for the future. We need to not forget about Charles Frederick Page.
Right.
And he's actually been forgotten about recently. In 1974, the Pineville City Council voted unanimously to rename Highway 28 the Charles Page Highway. It never happened. In 2001, Mark Mullen, who was the architect for which was then the new Alexandria International Airport, heard about Page, and he wanted to do a mural about Page and his airship in the airport. And the England Air Base Commission turned it down. He's been forgotten about too many times. These are the things I want to accomplish. I want to get that Highway 28 section finally named after 46 years, the Charles Page Highway.
Wow.
I want a historical marker at his home site at the corner of Edgewood and Highway 28. I want that mural after 19 years to finally be put up at the airport. I think this man is deserving of a high school, elementary school named after him, a monument, a plaque. We need not forget about this man, and it could so well happen. Currently, I wrote an article, and it's in the CENLA Focus magazine for the August edition, so you can pick that up anywhere, including the CENLA Focus office, if people want to read about him. But we need to do more than just talk about him.
Right.
We need to put some permanent things in place to remember him. It's because of him, Pineville and Alexandria are the birthplace of aviation in Louisiana, if not America.
Wow. Well, keep us posted. And Mr. Joe, thank you so much. This really explains your entrepreneurial spirit and your life's work really at helping small businesses just like ours to get up and going. And we can see where a lot of that tenacity and that drive comes from. We just want to thank you both for sharing, Mr. Joe, your family's story, and Michael, you sharing history. And we really would love to follow it to see, how this gets carved into history so that Americans and people in Central Louisiana can know exactly what Mr. Page did as a part of history. Thank you so much for sharing the story and doing the work to excavate this story that should have been told and archived and etched in history many, many years ago. Thank you both for sharing.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you, Carlette, for allowing us to tell a story. And the other thing that the Page family wants out of this is for history to recognize my grandfather for what he accomplished.
Absolutely. And we're going to follow it, and we believe that it will happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Indeed. Hey, everybody, stay on point. We're back after this.